In the quiet of the night, a little girl's final stroke on her drawing marked the painful start of her family's journey to heal after betrayal. Together, they would face the future, uncertain yet full of hope. Victor's betrayal still lingered, heavy and unspoken as George vowed, "We will make sure he never hurts us again." But shadows from their past haunted them, in dreams and regrets. Could they truly heal? Or would Victor's anger destroy everything they'd fought to rebuild? Before we journey further into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Hit that bell icon now so you never miss an incredible tale. Join our community by liking, sharing, and commenting to keep these heartwarming stories coming. And hey, tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with you all. The sun streamed through the large living room window of the Jenkins household, casting a golden glow over the breakfast table. George Jenkins, a tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile, passed a bowl of scrambled eggs to his wife Sarah. Her movements were graceful yet efficient, a testament to years of juggling the demands of family life. Their 8-year-old daughter, Andrea, sat at the head of the table, her legs swinging playfully under the chair. "Daddy, can we make pancakes next Saturday? The ones with the chocolate chips?" Andrea's eyes sparkled with excitement as she gazed up at her father. George chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Of course, my little artist. Saturday pancakes are a sacred tradition." Andrea beamed, reaching under her chair to pull out a crayon drawing. "I made this for you to take on your trip," she said, holding it up proudly. "It's me, you, and Mommy at the park." George took the drawing with exaggerated seriousness, his expression one of awe. "This is amazing, Andrea. It's going right on the wall of my office," he declared, planting a kiss on her forehead. Her chest swelled with pride at his words, the nickname Little Artist warming her heart. Later that morning, as George packed his suitcase, he double-checked his itinerary. "I should be back by Friday evening," he said, zipping up the bag. "Don't get into too much trouble without me," he added with a wink, his voice light. Sarah laughed softly, her calm demeanor unwavering. "We'll try, but no promises. Call when you land, okay?" "I will," George assured her. He crouched to Andrea's level, his tone softening. "You be good for Mommy, all right? I'll see you Saturday morning." Pancakes and all, Andrea wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck. "I'll miss you, Daddy." "I'll miss you too, sweet pea," George replied, his voice tinged with warmth as he stood and grabbed his bag. He waved one last time before heading out the door, leaving the house enveloped in a familiar, comforting routine. At first, everything seemed normal. That evening, George called from his hotel room, his voice cheerful but rushed. "Just got to the hotel," he said. "I'll call you tomorrow after the meetings." The next day, Sarah texted him during Andrea's ballet practice, asking about his day. Hours passed without a response. When George finally replied, it was with a short message. "Busy. All good." It wasn't like him. George was usually attentive, always finding time to check in no matter how hectic his schedule. Sarah tried calling later that night, but her call went straight to voicemail. She told herself it was just work stress, brushing off the unease creeping into her thoughts. By Thursday, George's texts and calls had become sporadic. Sarah couldn't ignore the growing knot of worry in her chest, but she decided not to dwell on it for Andrea's sake. On Friday morning, the sound of the front door opening startled Sarah as she stood in the kitchen. "George," she called, stepping into the hallway. "Surprise," George replied, standing in the doorway with his suitcase in hand. His smile was there, but something about it felt off. "Daddy, you're home early," Andrea shouted, bounding down the stairs and flinging herself into his arms. George hugged her, but the embrace lacked its usual warmth. "Missed you, kiddo," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Sarah studied him, her brow furrowing. "Everything okay? You weren't supposed to be back until tonight." He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. Meetings wrapped up early, Figured I'd come home instead of sitting around a hotel room. At dinner, Sarah noticed more peculiarities. George seemed distant, barely engaging in conversation. Andrea, eager for bedtime, piped up, "Daddy, will you read me my bedtime story tonight? The one about the fox and the moon." George hesitated before nodding. "Sure thing, Andrea." Later, as Andrea handed him the book, George flipped through the pages with a frown. Which one was it again?" Andrea tilted her head, puzzled. "The one you always read to me. You remember, don't you?" George forced a chuckle. "Of course I do. Just testing you," he said quickly, finding the page. Andrea didn't seem convinced, but she let it go. That night, Sarah felt the strangeness more acutely. Handing George a cup of tea, she said casually, "You're full of surprises today. Coming back early, forgetting Andrea's story." He froze for a fraction of a second before flashing a thin smile. "Guess I'm just tired from all the traveling." Sarah nodded, but her unease deepened. Meanwhile, Andrea lay in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Unable to sleep, she tiptoed downstairs for a glass of water. Passing the living room, she froze. George stood by the fireplace, staring at a family photo, a picture of the three of them smiling at the park last summer. But his expression wasn't one of fondness. It was cold, calculating, distant. Andrea's heart pounded as she heard him whisper under his breath. Almost there, she darted back upstairs, her small body trembling as she slid under her blankets. Something about her father felt wrong, terribly wrong. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was heavy, as though the warm energy that once filled it had drained away. At the breakfast table, Andrea ate her cereal quietly. George flipped through a newspaper, his eyes scanning the pages without interest. Sarah placed a steaming plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "Here you go," she said, her voice gentle. George stared at the plate for a long moment, his face unreadable. The soft golden sunlight filtered through the windows of the Jenkins household, painting everything in a warm glow. But the warmth in the room didn't match the cold, uneasy air that had settled over the family. "I don't really eat this kind of stuff anymore," George said flatly, pushing his plate away. His voice carried a detachment that was hard to ignore. Sarah blinked, her brows knitting together in confusion. "But you love eggs and toast," she replied, trying to keep her tone light, almost playful, as if she could coax him back to his old self. George shrugged without meeting her eyes. "Not anymore." Across the table, their young daughter Andrea frowned, her wide brown eyes darting between her parents. "Do you still like pancakes, Daddy?" she asked softly, her small voice breaking the growing tension. George's eyes remained fixed on the newspaper in his hands. "Let's not worry about pancakes," he said curtly, flipping a page with unnecessary force. "We should focus on moving forward instead of clinging to silly traditions." Andrea's face fell, and Sarah's heart ached for her. Pancakes weren't just food in their household. They were a ritual, a symbol of togetherness. George's dismissive tone felt like a deliberate crack in the foundation of their family. Later that day, Sarah passed George's office and noticed the door shut, an unusual sight. George never kept his door closed, especially on weekends. She hesitated before knocking gently. "George, everything okay?" There was a pause before his muffled voice replied, "Just busy. I'll be out in a bit." Sarah's hand lingered on the doorknob as she heard his low, serious tone from within. "No, it's too soon. I need more time. I'll sort it out," he said, his words laced with urgency. Her heart sank as she walked away. What was he hiding? The changes were even harder for Andrea, who missed the little things. Her father's playful nicknames, bedtime stories, and the way his hugs made her feel like the safest girl in the world. One evening, as George stood at the kitchen counter sorting through a stack of papers, Andrea approached him cautiously. "Daddy," she began hesitantly, clutching her sketch pad. "Why don't you call me your little artist anymore? George froze for a moment before looking down at her. "What?" he asked, as though the nickname was foreign to him. "You used to call me that," she said, her voice trembling. He forced a smile. "You're not little anymore, Andrea. You're growing up." Andrea nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. But inside, she didn't feel like she was growing. She felt like she was shrinking, lost in the growing distance between her and her father. The following Saturday, Sarah decided to revive an old tradition. Waking early, she prepared a stack of fluffy pancakes, imagining Andrea's delight. By the time the table was set, Andrea had wandered downstairs, her eyes lighting up. "Mommy, you made pancakes," she exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. Sarah kissed her forehead. "Of course. Go wake Daddy so we can eat together." Moments later, Andrea returned, her expression downcast. "Daddy said he doesn't want any." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "He said that?" Andrea nodded silently. The two ate in a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The pancakes didn't taste the same anymore. A few days later, while doing the laundry, Sarah found a crumpled receipt in George's jacket pocket. Her curiosity turned into dread as she read the details. A designer store downtown, an expensive necklace, and a dress. That evening, she confronted him. "George, can we talk?" she asked as he stood by the sink rinsing his coffee mug. "Sure," he replied, not looking at her. She held up the receipt. "What's this?" He glanced at it briefly, before returning his attention to the sink. "It's nothing. Just business gift for clients." "Business gifts?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "Jewelry and clothes? That's a little extravagant, don't you think?" George sighed, setting the mug down harder than necessary. "Do we really need to do this right now? It's nothing. Let it go." Her frustration bubbled over. "You've been so distant lately. If something's going on, you can tell me. You know that, right?" "There's nothing going on," he said firmly, meeting her gaze for a fleeting moment before walking away. Andrea's unease grew with each passing day. One night, as George sat on the couch watching TV, she approached him timidly. "Daddy," she said hesitantly. He muted the television. "What is it, Andrea? Why don't you tuck me in at night anymore?" George sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're old enough to fall asleep on your own now. You don't need me to tuck you in." Andrea's lip quivered. "But you used to. You always did." "Well, things change," he said dismissively, turning the TV back on. Andrea went to bed that night, clutching her stuffed rabbit, feeling lonelier than ever. One evening, as Sarah passed George's office, she heard him on the phone again, his voice low but insistent. "No, listen," he said. "I've got it under control. We just need a little more time. I'll handle it." Sarah pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. "Yes, yes," George continued. "Once everything's finalized, we'll have what we need. Just wait." That night, as they lay in bed, Sarah reached for George's hand, desperate to bridge the growing gap between them. But he pulled away, muttering, "This isn't working," before rolling over to face the wall. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stared at the ceiling, feeling a deep, terrible certainty. Something was profoundly wrong. The days dragged on with a suffocating tension. George was coming home late, avoiding conversations and retreating further into himself. Andrea, clutching her sketch pad one evening, whispered to Sarah, "Mommy, Daddy feels different. He's not fun anymore. It's like he's not really Daddy." Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, her own fears mirrored in Andrea's innocent words. Whatever George was hiding, it was unraveling the very fabric of their family. The soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated Sarah's room as Andrea clung to her, tears dampening Sarah's shoulder. "Sweetheart," Sarah whispered, trying to sound reassuring despite the heaviness in her chest. "Daddy's just going through something. I'll figure it out, okay?" Andrea's small frame trembled as she buried her face deeper into Sarah's embrace. "I don't like it, Mommy," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I just want the old daddy back. Sarah gently stroked her daughter's hair, her own thoughts mirroring Andrea's longing. The house had grown colder, more distant, just like George. That night, as Andrea finally drifted off to a restless sleep, Sarah stood in the kitchen, absently wiping the counter. Her eyes landed on George's work bag, abandoned near the edge of the counter. He had gone upstairs in a hurry, leaving it behind. Something about the bag caught her attention. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the zipper. It's just a tidy-up, she told herself as she carefully opened it. Among the neatly stacked papers and folders, an unfamiliar item caught her eye, a sleek bottle of cologne. It wasn't the woodsy scent George had always worn, the one she loved and associated with him. This was sharp, musky, and distinctly different. Sarah's fingers tightened around the bottle as her stomach knotted. Is this for him or someone else? She whispered, her mind swirling with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Placing the cologne back into the bag, she zipped it up, her heart heavy. The following evening, Sarah's resolve hardened. After Andrea had been tucked into bed, Sarah sat waiting in the living room, the receipt she'd found earlier clutched in her hand. When George finally walked in, his jacket slung over one shoulder, Sarah stood. Her voice was steady, but her heart raced. "George," she said firmly, "we need to talk." He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can it wait? I've had a long day." "No, it can't." Sarah held up the receipt. "I found this and the cologne in your bag. What's going on?" George's eyes flicked to the receipt, but his face betrayed nothing. "I told you before, Sarah. Those were business gifts." "For who?" she demanded, her voice rising. "They're not for me. And that cologne, it's not even your usual scent. You hate musky colognes." George sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Sarah, you're reading too much into this. It's just work. You wouldn't understand. Then help me understand." Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of her frustration. "You've been distant cold. You're not the man I married. Andrea feels it too. She told me she doesn't even recognize you anymore. What's going on, George?" George ran a hand through his hair, clearly growing impatient. "I'm tired, Sarah. I don't have time for this." "You don't have time?" Sarah's voice rose with desperation. "You don't have time for your family anymore? For your wife and daughter? If there's something you're not telling me, George, now's the time." For a long moment, George stared at her, his expression hardening. Then, finally, he spoke. "Fine. You want the truth? This isn't working. We're not the same people anymore, Sarah. It's better for everyone if we just move on." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Move on," she echoed, barely able to get the words out. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "Yes," George said bluntly. "I've been thinking about it for a while. It's time to end this." Her heart shattered. "George, how can you even say that? What about Andrea? What about us?" "We'll work out something for Andrea," he said coldly. "But this marriage is over." As George brushed past her and went upstairs, Sarah sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Upstairs, Andrea lay in bed, unable to sleep. Hearing the muffled argument, she crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. Her heart broke as she saw her mother sobbing on the couch. Quietly, Andrea tiptoed down the stairs and sat beside Sarah. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Sarah wiped her tears, forcing a weak smile. "I'm okay, baby." Andrea leaned against her, clutching Sarah's arm. I don't want to leave you, Mommy. Please don't let Daddy take me away." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she hugged her daughter tightly. "I won't, sweetheart. I promise." The house felt emptier the next day. George avoided both Sarah and Andrea, retreating to his office or leaving for hours. That night, Andrea woke up thirsty and went downstairs for a glass of water. Passing George's office, she heard his voice, low and conspiratorial. "No, It's almost done, he was saying. Once the divorce is finalized, the money will be ours. Andrea froze, her small hands clutching the banister. Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened. Yeah, I've got everything lined up, George continued. She has no idea. Just a little longer, and we'll be set. Tears stung Andrea's eyes as she tiptoed back upstairs. Climbing into bed, she hugged her stuffed rabbit tightly. This isn't my daddy, she whispered. My real daddy would never talk like that. Andrea sat on her bed, fiddling with the bracelet her father had given her. Its shiny surface caught the dim light, but to her it felt cold and unfamiliar, much like the man who had handed it to her. I just want you to be happy, he had said, his tone light and rehearsed. Your mom's been upset lately, but that doesn't mean we can't have fun. Maybe this weekend, we'll go to the water park you've been asking about. Andrea had nodded, clutching the bracelet as if it could somehow reassure her. But deep down, an uneasiness gnawed at her. His words sounded nice, but they didn't feel right. They didn't feel like him. As the first custody hearing approached, Sarah sat in her bedroom late at night, poring over the evidence she and her lawyer Linda had meticulously gathered. The weight of what lay ahead was suffocating. Linda had assured her that George's team carried the burden of proof, but the thought of sitting across from the man she once loved in a courtroom filled her with dread. The courtroom was an imposing space, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Sarah sat beside Linda, gripping her hands tightly in her lap. Across the room, George sat confidently with his lawyer, nodding occasionally as if he had nothing to fear. His demeanor was calm, almost smug, as his lawyer painted him as the ideal father. Mr. Jenkins has provided a loving and stable environment for his daughter, the lawyer said smoothly. He has ensured Andrea's needs are met. Despite the emotional turbulence in the household, Sarah's chest tightened as the words cut through her. The lawyer continued. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jenkins has understandably struggled to adjust. However, her grief has affected her ability to provide the consistency Andrea needs. Linda leaned in and whispered, Stay calm. Let me handle this. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she rose with quiet confidence. Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Jenkins, has been a devoted mother who has always prioritized her daughter's well-being. In contrast, Mr. Jenkins's recent behavior raises serious concerns. He has been secretive, manipulative, and dismissive of both Andrea's emotional needs and his responsibilities as a parent. Linda presented the evidence. Receipts for extravagant purchases, text messages, and Sarah's testimony about George's sudden change in behavior. The judge listened intently, her expression neutral. During the recess, Sarah and Andrea sat in the hallway outside the courtroom. Andrea clung to her mother's arm, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder. Mommy, Andrea said quietly, Daddy isn't like before. He knows things he shouldn't know. Sarah frowned, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. What do you mean, sweetheart? Andrea hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the bracelet. He talked about the red umbrella at the beach house, but he wasn't there. He was on a trip when we went. Sarah's stomach dropped. Are you sure he mentioned it? Andrea nodded solemnly. He said something about how pretty it looked against the ocean. But only you and I saw it. Sarah's mind raced. How could George know about the umbrella? She thought back to the text she had found. Keep her distracted. We're almost there. What was he planning? Back in the courtroom, George's lawyer continued to subtly suggest that Sarah's grief made her overly protective and unstable. Sarah clenched her fists under the table, forcing herself to stay composed. Then, suddenly, Andrea stood up, her small voice cutting through the tension in the room. He's not my dad. The courtroom fell silent. Every head turned toward Andrea, who stood in the center of the aisle, her fists clenched at her sides. What did you say? The judge asked, her tone gentle but firm. Andrea's gaze remained fixed on the judge. He's not my dad, she repeated, her voice stronger now. He looks like him, but he's not. The judge leaned forward, her tone measured. Andrea, can you explain what you mean? Why do you think this man isn't your father? Andrea glanced at Sarah, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a shaky breath, Andrea said, "He doesn't act like Daddy anymore. He calls me the girl. My real daddy always called me his little artist." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and the judge banged her gavel for order. "Go on, Andrea. What else makes you feel this way?" Andrea fidgeted with her hands, her voice trembling. "I heard him on the phone one night. He said something about the money and how everything would be fine once things were finalized. And he doesn't feel like Daddy. He's mean now, and he doesn't care about me or Mommy." The judge glanced at George, whose jaw was tight and fists clenched. "Mr. Jenkins, do you have anything to say about this?" George stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "She's just a child. She's confused. I've done everything I can for her, and this is how I'm treated? This is absurd." The judge raised her hand to silence him. "Sit down, Mr. Jenkins. We'll get to the bottom of this." Turning back to Andrea, the judge asked gently, "Andrea, did you overhear anything else? Anything specific that stood out?" Andrea nodded quickly. He said, "Once the money is ours, it'll all be over." The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers as Sarah pulled Andrea close, whispering, "You're so brave, sweetheart." The judge leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. "Given the severity of these allegations, I'm ordering immediate DNA testing to confirm Mr. Jenkins' identity." George, or the man pretending to be George, went pale. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm her father. There's no need for this." "Then you have nothing to worry about," the judge said curtly. "Until the results are confirmed, I'm placing Mr. Jenkins in temporary detention for questioning." When the DNA results came back, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The judge's calm yet commanding voice echoed through the room. "This court has determined, based on the DNA evidence provided, that the man claiming to be George Jenkins is not Andrea Jenkins' biological father." Sarah felt the weight of the revelation crash over her like a wave. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, struggling to process the truth. Beside her, Andrea clung tightly to her arm, her wide eyes filled with both fear and relief. Across the room, the man they all believed to be George slumped in his chair, his mask of confidence shattered. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the judge delivered the verdict. Based on the DNA evidence, this court has determined that the man claiming to be George Jenkins is not Andrea Jenkins' biological father. Sarah's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a sledgehammer against the fragile reality she clung to. Across the room, the man who had pretended to be George rose abruptly, his face a mask of outrage. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice sharp and unsteady. "You've got it all wrong. That test is a mistake." The judge raised her hand, her tone firm but calm. "Mr. Jenkins, or whoever you are, the results are conclusive. You are not Andrea's biological father." Murmurs rippled through the gallery, a tide of disbelief and speculation. The imposter's gaze darted around the room, his eyes flashing with desperation. "You have no idea what you're doing," he bellowed, his voice rising to a dangerous pitch. "I am George Jenkins. I've lived in that house. I provided for my family." The judge didn't flinch. "Bailiffs, detain him for further questioning," she ordered. 2 officers approached the imposter, their movements cautious but deliberate. He took a step back, his expression shifting from anger to cold calculation. "You're making a huge mistake," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "Escort him out," the judge commanded. As the officers took him by the arms, the man didn't resist, but his gaze locked onto Sarah. The look he gave her sent a shiver down her spine, a predator sizing up its prey. She clutched Andrea tightly, her maternal instincts roaring to life, shielding her daughter from the malevolent energy radiating from the imposter. The sterile, harshly lit interrogation room felt oppressive. The man sat slouched in his chair, his face a blank mask of defiance. Not a word had passed his lips since he'd been brought in, his silence an unspoken challenge. Across from him, The lead detective adjusted a folder on the table, his calm demeanor belying the tension in the air. "Let's skip the formalities," the detective began, his voice measured but firm. "We know you're not George Jenkins. The DNA evidence confirms that. So why don't we start with your name?" The man smirked, his lips curling with a mix of arrogance and disdain. "You want my name? Fine. It's Victor. Victor Jenkins." The detective's pen paused midair, his brow furrowing slightly. "Jenkins? What's your connection to George?" Victor's smirk widened, a bitter glint in his eyes. "We're twins. Bet you didn't see that coming, huh?" In the observation room, Sarah's breath hitched. "Twins?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Andrea tugged at her sleeve, her small face etched with confusion. "Mommy, what does he mean? Daddy has a twin." Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling. I didn't know, sweetheart. I didn't know." Back in the interrogation room, the detective pressed on, his tone unyielding. "Why impersonate your brother? What's your motive?" Victor leaned back, crossing his arms with a bitter laugh. "Motive? I think that's obvious. George had it all. The perfect life, the perfect family, the perfect house. Me? I got nothing." "Nothing?" The detective's eyes narrowed. "You're saying George took something from you?" Victor's tone turned venomous. "He didn't just take something. He took everything. When our parents divorced, George got to stay with Mom. I was left with Dad, a drunk, an abuser, a mess. While George was playing house with the picture-perfect family, I was fighting for scraps." The detective remained stoic, letting the words hang in the air. "For years," Victor continued, his voice thick with bitterness, "I watched him live the life that should have been mine. I scraped by, working dead-end jobs, while he bought beach houses and started college funds for a daughter who doesn't even appreciate him." The detective's expression didn't waver. "So, you thought taking his place would fix that?" Victor's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Not just fix it, replace it. I wanted to show him how easy it is to take what doesn't belong to you. I wanted it all. His money, his wife, his kid. All of it." In the observation room, Sarah's fists clenched, anger and disbelief surging through her. "How could he?" she muttered, tears stinging her eyes. Andrea hugged her tightly. "Mommy, where's Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Sarah's voice quivered, but her resolve was firm. "We'll find him, sweetheart. We'll bring him home." The detective leaned forward, his tone sharper now. "Where is George? What did you do to him?" Victor's smile faltered, a flicker of fear crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "He's fine for now." "For now," the detective repeated, his voice rising. "What does that mean? Where is he?" Victor's smirk returned, but his bravado seemed forced. "You'll figure it out," he said cryptically. "You've got your DNA tests, your fancy investigators. You're so smart, right? Go find him." The detective stood, his jaw tightening. "Take him back to his cell," he instructed the officers. As Victor was led away, he turned and locked eyes with Sarah through the observation glass, his gaze sending an icy chill down her spine. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic investigation. Every lead, every clue, every detail Victor had let slip was scrutinized and pieced together. For Sarah, the hours stretched into an eternity. She sat in her living room, clutching her phone, waiting for news. Andrea sat beside her, quietly drawing. Her small hands trembled as she gripped her colored pencils, but she pressed on. Finally, she held up her picture, a family holding hands with bold letters at the top. "Come home, Daddy." It was a reminder of what was at stake, a beacon of hope in the storm. And Sarah vowed with every fiber of her being that they would not give up until George was home. The air felt thick with uncertainty as Andrea's small, trembling voice broke the silence. "Do you think they'll find him, Mommy?" Her wide, tear-filled eyes searched Sarah's face, desperate for reassurance. Sarah knelt down, her hands gently brushing back Andrea's curls, and kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby," she whispered. Her voice resolute though her heart felt heavy with fear. "They'll find him, and he'll come home to us." Andrea hugged her tightly, clutching the crumpled drawing she had poured her heart into. "Please bring Daddy back," she murmured, her words more prayer than plea. At the police station, the tension was palpable. A detective entered the briefing room, holding up a crumpled receipt. "We found this in Victor's belongings," he announced. "It's a rental car receipt placing him in a remote area about 4 hours from here." Another officer quickly pulled up data from Victor's phone. "There's more. He made repeated trips to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It's off the grid, far from any main roads. If he was holding George anywhere, it's there." Without hesitation, a team was assembled. The convoy of police vehicles tore through winding roads, their urgency cutting through the stillness of the countryside. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah and Andrea waited, each second stretching unbearably. Andrea sat curled on the couch, her small hands gripping colored pencils as she poured her emotions into another drawing. She handed it to Sarah, a simple, heartfelt picture of their family holding hands. The words "come home," Daddy scrawled in bold, uneven letters. The cabin loomed ominously as the team approached, its boarded-up windows and weathered walls nearly hidden by overgrown brush. Darkness seemed to cling to it, and the quiet was almost oppressive. "On my count," the lead officer whispered, signaling the others. In a swift motion, the door was breached. Inside, the stench of decay assaulted them. Flashlights swept through the shadows, illuminating the dilapidated interior. The tension was electric. "In here," an officer called out. His voice carried urgency as the team closed in. A woman with sharp, angular features stood frozen, caught rummaging through a bag. Her eyes widened in panic before she bolted for the back door. "We've got a runner," another officer shouted, taking off in pursuit. As she was tackled and restrained, she spat venomous curses, her resistance fierce but futile. In the far corner of the cabin, they found George. His frail body slumped in a chair, his wrists and ankles raw and bruised from the ropes that had bound him. His clothes were tattered, his face hollowed by exhaustion and malnutrition. "George Jenkins," an officer asked, kneeling beside him. His lips parted weakly. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The officers worked quickly, freeing him with care. "We've got him," one reported into his radio. "He's alive, but he needs immediate medical attention." As George was placed on a stretcher, his unfocused gaze landed briefly on the restrained woman. Who is she?" he murmured. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing definitive. "We'll find out," one muttered. "Let's get you out of here first." Back at the hospital, Sarah and Andrea raced through the sterile halls, their hearts pounding. When they reached George's room, Sarah froze. Her breath caught as she saw him lying in the bed, and four in his arm, his face pale and gaunt. Yet, when his eyes met hers, the warmth in them was unmistakable. "Daddy," Andrea cried, scrambling onto the chair beside him and throwing her arms around him with all the strength her little body could muster. George hugged her back as tears streamed down his cheeks. "Andrea," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My little artist." Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed one on his cheek. "George," she breathed, "you're home." His gaze held hers, a mixture of relief and guilt clouding his expression. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I'm sorry I put you and Andrea through this." Sarah shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "You're alive," she said firmly. "That's all that matters." Andrea nestled closer to him as George began to recount his harrowing ordeal, his voice halting and fraught with pain. "Victor ambushed me," he said. "He drugged me. When I woke up, I was in that cabin." "Victor?" Sarah's voice wavered, her brow furrowing in confusion. George nodded, wincing as he adjusted himself slightly. "He's my twin brother," he revealed, his words heavy with regret. "I didn't tell you because we hadn't spoken in decades. After our parents divorced, we went separate ways. He stayed with Dad, and I went with Mom. Our lives couldn't have been more different." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. He blamed me for everything, for having the life he thought he deserved. He said he wanted to take it all. My family, my career, my life. He wanted to erase me. Andrea clung to him tighter, her small face buried in his chest. "Daddy," she whispered through her tears. I was so scared. George kissed the top of her head, his own tears falling. "I'm here now, sweetheart. I'll never leave you again." As the family held each other, the weight of their ordeal began to lift. But the battle wasn't over. Victor's plot, the woman's involvement, and the depths of their schemes would take time to unravel. Yet in that moment, surrounded by love and safety, George knew one thing for certain. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. In the days that followed, as the authorities pieced together the full extent of Victor's plans, George, Sarah, and Andrea began to heal. Their home, once filled with fear and uncertainty, became a sanctuary of resilience and hope. And though the scars of their experience would remain, they faced a future together, stronger than ever. The room was heavy with emotion as George's voice broke the silence. He looked at his daughter, Andrea, whose wide, innocent eyes were filled with a mix of confusion and hope. "I knew it wasn't you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. "I told Mommy it wasn't you." George's smile was weak but filled with pride. His hand shakily reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "You're so brave, sweetheart. You saved me." The weight of his words hung in the air as he began recounting the nightmare he had endured. "I tried to get out, but he was always one step ahead," George murmured, his voice barely audible. "He overpowered me, locked me in, and left me to starve. I thought I'd never see you again." Sarah knelt beside him, her hand gripping his tightly, as if her touch alone could tether him back to safety. "You're here now," she said, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "You're safe, and we're going to make sure Victor never hurts us again." George nodded slowly, though the exhaustion in his eyes remained. "We need to," he whispered hoarsely. "He's dangerous, Sarah. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." That night, as George drifted into a fitful sleep, Sarah and Andrea remained by his side. Andrea placed a drawing she had made earlier, a picture of their family standing together under a bright blue sky, on the bedside table where George could see it. "Daddy's back," she whispered, her voice tinged with quiet relief. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, her gaze never leaving George. Despite the ordeal, a flicker of hope began to take root in her chest. They had found him. They were together again. But as she looked at George's frail form, she couldn't shake the looming shadow of Victor's threat. The courtroom buzzed with a tense energy, a sea of faces watching as Victor Jenkins was escorted to the defendant's table. His sharp suit and smug expression contrasted sharply with the gravity of his crimes. The air was thick with anticipation, silenced only by the resounding slam of the judge's gavel. Victor's lawyer, a composed and polished woman known for her defense of controversial clients, rose to deliver her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we are here to examine the actions of a man who, yes, made mistakes, grave ones. But we must also consider the context. Victor Jenkins grew up in circumstances no child should endure: poverty, abuse, neglect. His actions were driven not by malice, but by desperation, a deep-seated need to reclaim what he believed was taken from him." As her words painted Victor as a victim, Sarah's grip on George's hand tightened. She could feel the narrative being spun, a calculated attempt to shift the focus away from the monstrous acts Victor had committed. The prosecution wasted no time countering. "This case is not about desperation," the prosecutor began, her voice steady and firm. "It is about greed, manipulation, and a cold, calculated plan to destroy a man's life and steal everything he held dear. When George took the stand, the room fell silent. Though his hands trembled slightly, his voice was resolute as he recounted the harrowing details of his ordeal. "Victor ambushed me in my hotel room during a business trip," George began, his voice heavy with emotion. "He drugged me and took me to a remote cabin. I woke up tied to a chair with no idea where I was." The jury leaned forward, their expressions grim, as George detailed the psychological torment Victor had inflicted. "He told me he was going to take my life. Not just my identity, but my entire life. He said I didn't deserve any of it. The house, the career, my family. He blamed me for everything wrong in his life." Andrea was next to take the stand. The sight of the small girl climbing into the witness chair was both heartbreaking and powerful. Her legs swung slightly as she gripped the armrests, her voice soft but unwavering. "He didn't call me little artist," Andrea said. "My real daddy always calls me that. And he didn't sing the goodnight song. He called me the girl." Her testimony brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The innocence in Andrea's words highlighted the depth of Victor's deception. "I told Mommy because I knew she would help," Andrea concluded, her small shoulders visibly relaxing as she returned to her seat. When Sarah took the stand, her composure was firm, but her eyes betrayed the pain she carried. "He tried to alienate Andrea from me," Sarah said, her voice steady. "He told her I was upset because I didn't want things to change. But I knew something was wrong." The trial continued, each piece of evidence and testimony unraveling Victor's carefully constructed facade. George's twin brother, once a shadowy figure of the past, was revealed to be a man consumed by jealousy and resentment, willing to destroy lives to satisfy his bitterness. As the final verdict was read, the courtroom held its collective breath. Victor Jenkins was found guilty on all charges. That evening, Sarah and Andrea sat by George's hospital bed, their hands intertwined. George's eyes, though weary, held a newfound light. "You're safe now," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll never let him hurt us again." Andrea placed her drawing back on the table, adding a small heart to the corner. "Daddy's back," she said, her voice filled with hope. And for the first time in weeks, George allowed himself to believe it. Their family had been tested in ways they could never have imagined, but they had emerged stronger, bound by love and resilience. The road to healing was long, but together, they would face whatever came next. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, the courtroom heavy with anticipation. "He wasn't the man I married," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "He was cold, distant, and calculating." The prosecutor guided Sarah through a timeline of deceit, each revelation painting a more vivid picture of Victor's sinister intentions. From receipts for extravagant purchases that didn't match their usual spending to a locked office door, concealing forged documents aimed at liquidating their assets, every detail exposed his calculated plan. He wasn't just trying to take over George's life, Sarah concluded, her tone resolute. He was trying to erase it. When Sarah stepped down, the room buzzed with murmurs until the prosecutor called the next witness. "The prosecution calls Elena Carter to the stand," the lawyer announced. A hush fell as Elena entered, her sharp features illuminated under the courtroom's harsh lights. Her expression was carefully composed, but her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Elena Carter, you've been identified as a key participant in Victor Jenkins's crimes. Would you care to explain your involvement?" Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but measured. "I was manipulated," she said, her words rehearsed. "Victor told me this was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully his. I didn't know how far he would go." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Manipulated? Are you saying you weren't aware you were aiding in identity theft, fraud, and kidnapping?" Elena's gaze flickered to Victor, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable. She hesitated. "I followed instructions," she said at last. "He assured me it was temporary, that no one would get hurt." Without missing a beat, the prosecutor presented the damning evidence. Emails and text messages between Victor and Elena were displayed on courtroom screens, their content unraveling her facade. In one email, Elena had written, "Once the assets are transferred, we'll disappear for good. No loose ends." A ripple of shock spread through the jury. The prosecutor pressed play on a voicemail. Elena's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. "Don't mess this up, Victor. We've come too far. Everything depends on you finalizing the divorce." Elena's mask cracked. Her lips tightened, her hands clenching on the stand. The prosecutor pressed further. "Elena, you personally visited the cabin where George Jenkins was being held, didn't you?" Elena hesitated, her composure faltering. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly, "but I didn't hurt him. That was all Victor." The prosecutor's voice sharpened. "So bringing food to a man you knew was tied up and malnourished doesn't count as participating? You didn't just follow instructions, Elena. You enabled Victor every step of the way." Elena's gaze dropped to her lap, her silence confirming the prosecution's argument. The defense tried to paint Victor as a man driven by desperation rather than malice, recounting his traumatic childhood filled with poverty, abuse, and neglect. Victor Jenkins wasn't trying to harm anyone, his lawyer argued. He was a man consumed by his own struggles, seeking a life he thought he deserved. His actions, though misguided, came from a place of pain, not greed. Victor, coached to appear remorseful, nodded slightly, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a carefully crafted look of regret. But the prosecution had one final card to play. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, holding up a small recording device, "we have additional evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The prosecutor pressed play, and Victor's unmistakable voice filled the courtroom, cold and devoid of remorse. "Once they're out of the way, everything will be mine." The weight of the words hung heavy in the room. The jury's expression shifted, any lingering sympathy evaporating. Sarah covered her mouth, her stomach churning, as she heard the chilling confession. Andrea clutched her father's arm, her small frame trembling. The prosecutor let the recording play to its end before speaking. This was recovered from a recording device in Victor's belongings. It leaves no doubt about his intentions. Victor Jenkins wasn't driven by desperation. He was driven by greed and malice. Victor's confident facade shattered. His jaw tightened, his fist clenched, but he said nothing. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to crush him. The courtroom grew silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Sarah held George's hand tightly. Andrea nestled between them, her head resting on her father's shoulder. Across the room, Victor stood, smoothing his suit as though attending a business meeting. The judge's voice broke the silence. In the matter of identity theft, kidnapping, fraud, and attempted murder, the jury finds the defendant, Victor Jenkins, guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the room. Relief washed over Sarah as she exhaled shakily. George's shoulders sagged, the tension of the past months finally releasing. Victor's expression hardened, his mask of confidence gone. As he was led away, his calculating eyes briefly met Sarah's. She held his gaze, her resolve unshaken. Later that evening, back at home, George sat with Andrea, holding her drawing of their reunited family. Sarah joined them, her arms wrapping around both. "We're safe now," she whispered. Andrea smiled, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Daddy's back." And for the first time in months, the shadow of Victor's threat no longer loomed over them. They were together, a family again, ready to rebuild their lives stronger than ever. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. All eyes were on the judge as she delivered the final sentence. "Given the severity of these crimes," she declared, her voice firm, "the defendant is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words reverberated through the room like a thunderclap. Victor's reaction was instant and explosive. He spun toward George, his face twisted in rage, his voice booming. "You think you've won? You think locking me away changes anything?" His eyes blazed with fury as the bailiffs moved swiftly to restrain him. "You'll always be the reason our family was destroyed. You don't deserve them. You don't deserve any of it." George sat frozen, pale as a ghost. Victor's words pierced him, dredging up buried memories of their turbulent past, the arguments between their parents, the nights of tears, and the moment he chose to leave Victor behind. The guilt he'd carried all these years felt heavier than ever. Andrea, sensing her father's distress, reached out with her small hand and tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. George blinked, forcing himself to focus on her. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he replied, though his voice betrayed the storm raging within him. He glanced at Sarah, whose grip on his hand was steady, her expression firm, yet her eyes reflected the same unease he felt. As Victor was led away, his anger melted into a chilling calm. Turning back one last time, he locked eyes with George, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This isn't over." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Andrea buried her face against her father, clutching his sleeve as if seeking protection from a shadow she couldn't see. The courtroom, though no longer filled with Victor's voice, felt haunted by his parting words. The judge's focus shifted. "Elena Carter, please rise." Elena hesitated, her hands trembling as she stood. Unlike Victor's fiery defiance, her demeanor was a mix of fear and regret. The judge's voice remained stern as she addressed her. "In the matter of aiding and abetting identity theft, fraud, and kidnapping, the jury finds you guilty on all counts." Murmurs rippled through the gallery as Elena's shoulders sagged. She glanced toward Victor, her expression searching for some acknowledgement, but he refused to meet her gaze. "Given the evidence presented," the judge continued, "this court sentences you to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Elena's mask of composure cracked. I didn't know it would go this far," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The judge's tone did not waver. "Your actions directly contributed to these crimes, Ms. Carter. Ignorance does not absolve responsibility." As she was escorted away, Elena cast a fleeting look toward George and Sarah, her eyes filled with what seemed like remorse. Sarah felt her chest tighten, unsure whether to pity or condemn the woman who had played such a significant role in their nightmare. The courtroom began to empty, but Victor's parting words clung to the air like a dark cloud. Outside, the media swarmed, their cameras flashing like bursts of lightning. Sarah held Andrea close as George guided them to their car, his silence heavy and unyielding. Inside the car, Andrea broke the tension. "Mommy, is Uncle Victor going to hurt us again?" Sarah turned in her seat, her heart breaking at the fear in her daughter's voice. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's going to prison. He can't hurt us anymore." Andrea nodded but still seemed unsure. She looked at George, who was staring out of the window, his face etched with turmoil. "Daddy," she whispered, "why was Uncle Victor so angry?" George's shoulders slumped as he turned to face her. Because he thinks I took something from him." "But that's not true, Andrea. He made his own choices." "But he's still your brother, right?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. George hesitated, his throat tightening. "Yes," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "He's still my brother." Later that evening, the weight of the day settled over the family like a heavy blanket. George sat in the living room, staring at a drawing Andrea had made, a family portrait with bright smiles and a sunny sky. His fingers trembled as he traced the crayon strokes. Sarah entered, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of George and placed a hand gently on his knee. "You're thinking about what he said," she murmured. George nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's right, Sarah. I should have done more for him. Maybe if I hadn't left him with our father." Sarah cut him off, her voice firm but compassionate. "George, don't do this. Victor made his choices. What happened to him wasn't your fault." "But it feels like it is," George replied, his voice cracking. "He was my brother, and I let him grow up in that nightmare. I got out, and he didn't. Sarah squeezed his hand tightly. You were a child, George. It wasn't your responsibility to fix what your parents broke. Victor's anger isn't about you. It's about him. He let that anger consume him, and that's on him, not you. George closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. I feel like I failed him. And now, he's ruined so much for us. You didn't fail him, Sarah said gently. And you haven't failed us. You're here, George. You fought to come back to us. That's what matters. Upstairs, Andrea sat on her bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her mind swirled with questions she couldn't quite articulate. Victor had done terrible things, tried to tear her family apart, but he was still her uncle. The thought left an ache in her chest she didn't understand. She pulled out her crayons and began a new drawing, a picture of her family, together and smiling. It was her way of holding on to hope, of trying to mend what felt broken. Downstairs, George and Sarah sat in quiet companionship, their hands entwined. Though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew they would face it together, holding on to the love that Victor could never destroy. The air was thick with tension, as the courtroom's heavy silence seemed to hang over everything. The judge's words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of years of pain, betrayal, and shattered lives. Given the severity of these crimes, the judge began, her voice steady yet resolute. The defendant is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Victor's reaction was immediate. His body jerked, his face twisting in a grotesque mask of rage as he shot a venomous look toward George. You think you've won? His voice echoed in the courtroom, reverberating like a storm trapped within four walls. You'll always be the reason our family was destroyed. You don't deserve any of this, any of them. The bailiffs rushed forward, but Victor fought back, his arms flailing as they tried to subdue him. You took everything from me, he bellowed. Everything? You think locking me away will fix it? You can't fix what you've broken, George. Frozen. George stood motionless, his face pale as his eyes widened with shock. The bitter words cut through him like a blade, dredging up memories he had long buried. The fights between their parents, the cold neglect he had left behind, and the weight of guilt he carried, a burden that was never his to bear. Victor's words dragged him back to that dark place, where anger and resentment had taken root, where family had been torn apart. But it was Andrea's small voice that broke the heavy silence, piercing through the tension that had enveloped them all. Daddy, are you okay? George blinked, coming back to the present as his daughter's innocent concern pulled him from the depths of his turmoil. His face softened as he turned toward her, offering a smile that was more for her sake than his own. I'm okay, sweetheart, he said, though the lack of conviction in his voice betrayed the storm brewing inside. As Victor was led out of the courtroom, his anger began to morph into a cold, bitter resolve. He glanced back over his shoulder, his dark eyes locked onto George's with a menacing intensity that chilled Sarah to the bone. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low, full of venom. Sarah shuddered, pulling Andrea closer as the air grew thick with the unspoken threat that still loomed over them. Andrea buried her face into her father's arm, her small hands clutching his sleeve as the chill of fear gripped her. As the doors closed behind Victor, the judge shifted her focus to Elena Carter, who had been seated next to him at the defense table. The courtroom held its breath as Elena stood, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Unlike Victor, whose smug composure had never faltered, Elena's face bore the unmistakable marks of regret, fear, and uncertainty. Elena Carter, please rise, the judge commanded. Her voice was firm, unyielding. Elena's legs shook as she stood, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the verdict that was about to come. In the matter of aiding and abetting identity theft, fraud, and kidnapping, the judge continued. The jury finds the defendant guilty on all counts. A murmur rippled through the room, the gravity of Elena's guilt settling over everyone like a dark cloud. As the judge spoke again, Elena's face fell, her hope slipping away like sand through her fingers. Given the evidence presented and the gravity of your involvement, the judge intoned, this court sentences you to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Elena glanced toward Victor, her eyes searching for some sign of recognition, of acknowledgement. But Victor remained fixated on George, his jaw clenched in barely contained rage. The BFFs moved forward to escort Elena from the courtroom, but for the first time, the veneer of calm she had maintained for so long cracked. As the handcuffs clicked into place, her lips trembled. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The judge's response was cold, unrelenting. Claiming ignorance does not absolve you of responsibility. As Elena was led away, her final glance at Sarah and George was one of fleeting regret, a look that vanished almost as soon as it appeared, swallowed by the weight of her own actions. Sarah's hand tightened around George's as she watched Elena disappear through the courtroom doors. Her heart pounded in her chest, the echoes of the past still haunting her. But now, more than ever, she was determined not to let fear define their future. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but Victor's words, sharp and bitter, lingered in the air like an unspoken curse. Outside, the media swarmed, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. Sarah shielded Andrea from the frenzy, her arms wrapping protectively around her daughter as they made their way to the car. George walked silently beside them, the weight of the past few hours pressing down on them all. Once they were safely inside the car, the silence stretched between them until Andrea broke it, her voice small and uncertain. "Mommy, is Uncle Victor going to hurt us again?" Sarah's heart clenched as she turned to face her daughter, her voice soft but firm. "No, sweetheart. He's going to prison. He can't hurt us anymore." Andrea nodded slowly, her small face still shadowed by doubt. Her eyes shifted to George, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Why was Uncle Victor so angry? George's shoulders slumped as he turned to face her, his voice heavy with the weight of years of unresolved pain. "He's angry because he thinks I took something from him," he began, his throat tightening. "But that's not true, Andrea. He made his own choices." Andrea's brow furrowed in confusion. "But he's still your brother, right?" George hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Yes, he is," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But that doesn't mean I was responsible for what happened to him. He chose his path." Later that evening, the weight of the day settled over the family like a heavy blanket. George sat in the living room, his gaze fixed on the family photo Andrea had drawn, a picture of the three of them, holding hands with bright smiles beneath a sunny sky. His fingers trembled as he traced the lines of her crayon strokes, a bittersweet ache in his chest. Sarah walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of George, sitting beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "You're thinking about what he said, aren't you?" she murmured. George nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's right," he said, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "I should have done more for him. I should have been there. Maybe if I hadn't left him with our father." Sarah shook her head firmly, cutting him off. "George, don't do this. You didn't make those choices. Victor did. What happened to him wasn't your fault. You were just a kid. You were trying to survive." "I feel like I failed him," George said, his voice cracking. "And now he's ruined everything for us." "You didn't fail him," Sarah said gently, her hand squeezing his tightly. "You didn't fail us. You're here, George. You fought to come back to us, and that's what matters. What happened to Victor? It was his choice, not yours." George closed his eyes, leaning into Sarah's touch, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Upstairs, Andrea sat on her bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly. Her mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. Victor had done terrible things, but he was still her uncle, her father's brother. The thought made her chest ache in ways she didn't fully understand. She pulled out the drawing she had done earlier and added another figure to the picture. Victor, but off to the side, his hands empty, his expression sad. She stared at it for a long time before folding it and tucking it under her pillow. The night was quiet, but the emotions swirling within the family were anything but. And as they settled into bed that night, the weight of the past slowly began to lift, replaced by the fragile sense of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could heal. George, Sarah, and Andrea were ready to rebuild together. They would face whatever came next, side by side as a family. They had already survived Victor's betrayal. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they would keep moving forward. The next morning, George and Andrea stood side by side in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, as they always did on Saturday mornings. The smell of sizzling batter filled the house, and Andrea's infectious laughter echoed as she carefully arranged blueberries on top of their pancakes. "You're getting better at this, little artist," George said with a grin, ruffling Andrea's hair. "I had a good teacher," Andrea beamed back. From the doorway, Sarah watched them, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had been through so much, but moments like this, the quiet simplicity of a Saturday morning, reminded her that healing was possible. Later that afternoon, Sarah suggested a family outing to the park. The park had been their sanctuary during George's captivity, and now it felt like the perfect place to mark a new chapter in their lives. As Andrea raced ahead, her laughter ringing out across the park, George smiled, jogging after her and giving her a gentle push on the swings. Sarah sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee, a soft smile playing on her lips. "She's so resilient," George said, his voice full of admiration. "She gets it from you," Sarah replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "No," George shook his head. "She gets it from us. From you especially. You kept everything together. I don't know how you did it." Sarah turned to him, her eyes soft but serious. "We did it together, George, and we'll keep doing it together." As they sat in the warmth of the autumn sun, the shadows of the past slowly faded. They had fought for their family, and now, together, they were ready to reclaim the life they had fought so hard to rebuild. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they were walking it together, stronger than ever. And as they left the park, hand in hand, with the weight of their past finally lifting, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next together.